I remember the sound before the sight of it, the faint shuffle of paper caught in the wind, circling the cobblestones of Radcliffe Square like an unclaimed thought. It was past 10, the hour when Oxford's pulse slackens into something that resembles guilt. The lamplight made small islands of gold across the rain-dark stones, and from the library windows came the echo of footsteps, or perhaps the memory of them. I had no intention of returning to the Bodleian that night. Habit led me there, not curiosity. The square has a way of drawing one back, as if beneath its paving lies the slow rhythm of all that was ever read, regretted, or left unsaid. And it was there, between the damp scent of books and the echo of my own indecision, that the whisper began. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. More a murmur through the stone air, like the beginning of a confession that never reaches completion. I thought, foolishly, of ghosts. Later, I would learn it was the sound of the chapel bell, muffled by scaffolding. Yet even knowing that, I couldn't unhear what I first believed, that someone, somewhere, was calling me by name. Lewis would have laughed in that quiet way of his, the way a man laughs when he's trying not to appear superstitious. He'd have said I'd had one whiskey too many. Perhaps he would have been right. But the next morning, when the papers reported the discovery of a body in the Radcliffe camera's basement archive, the memory of that whisper took on an altogether different hue. It is strange how death, in its early hours, refuses to announce itself as tragedy. It waits, polite, at the edge of one's consciousness, asking to be noticed. The archivist had been found by a student, a boy who mistook the body for someone asleep. The police, in their practiced understatement, called it an unfortunate accidental fall, perhaps. I, for reasons I could not yet articulate, did not agree. Something in the phrasing of the report caught my attention. The student, it said, had entered to return a misplaced manuscript. I underlined the word misplaced. Nothing in the Bodleian is ever truly misplaced. Catalogues have memories longer than their keepers. Later that day, I walked again beneath the Radcliffe dome. The sun, hesitant and indifferent, spilled across the stones. A group of tourists posed for photographs, smiling in the shadow of mortality. I descended the narrow stairway to the archives. The scent of old bindings and floor polish met me like an old acquaintance. The superintendent on duty, a man with the kind of face that believes in procedure more than truth, asked what brought me there. Curiosity, I told him. It was, I suppose, the truth in its simplest form. He led me to the place where the archivist had fallen. A faint smudge on the floor marked where the body had been removed. I crouched beside it, ignoring his frown. The stone was uneven, worn smooth in places where generations of scholars had trodden the same uncertain path. Yet there, amid the dust, I saw something, an impression, hardly visible, of a heel that did not match the dead man's shoes. I said nothing. Deduction, I've learned, is less about what one knows than what one chooses to keep silent. As we left, I paused by the desk where the archivist had worked. A crossword lay unfinished beside a stack of folios. The clue, half filled in, read, "Silent confession," 5 letters. The answer, perhaps, was there in the margin, written faintly in pencil, wisp. Not whisper, just wisp. The beginning of a word, or the end of a thought. That night I sat by my window overlooking the high street, a glass of Glenfiddich untouched at my elbow. The rain had returned, steady and unrepentant. Somewhere below, a woman's heels clicked across the pavement, quickening as though late for something important. I thought again of the archivist, of his quiet profession, of the whisper beneath Radcliffe Square, and I wondered not for the first time how often death begins not with a cry, but with a hesitation. The college had a habit of hiding its guilt behind ivy. I've often thought Oxford at its most deceitful when bathed in spring light, every stone too bright, every smile too courteous, every shadow rehearsed. It was on such a morning that I crossed into the quadrangle of St. Fridas Wides, summoned, though not officially, by the dean's assistant. A fellowship, he'd said, had been thrown into disorder by the archivist's death. Disorder was a word Oxford rarely used unless it meant scandal. Inside, the air carried that faintly ecclesiastical scent of candle wax, chalk dust, and old disputes. The fellows were gathered in the senior common room when I arrived, arranged as if for a portrait no artist had yet dared paint. Their conversation faltered the instant I entered. It is remarkable how silence can weigh heavier than any accusation. The dean was a mild man, too mild perhaps, the sort who mistook dignity for detachment. He spoke of the tragedy, of the college's sorrow, of the need to protect its reputation. Behind him, I noticed a portrait of some long-dead benefactor, the kind whose face was painted to appear wiser than it ever was. The dean's words flowed, soft and evasive, like water finding the lowest ground. I remember thinking that remorse, in Oxford, often comes pre-packaged in administrative language. A woman at the far end of the table drew my attention. She was younger than the others, an English don, perhaps, with that severe composure scholars wear like armor. Her eyes did not avoid mine, but nor did they invite curiosity. When I asked what connection she'd had to the deceased, she answered without hesitation. "He catalogued the romantic manuscripts," she said. I supervised the research attached to them. Her tone was disciplined, but the pulse in her throat betrayed some unspoken fear or guilt, or the unbearable intimacy of having once liked someone who died without warning. Afterwards, I walked through the cloisters with Lewis, who had arrived in time to miss the speeches and catch the discomfort. He wondered aloud why I had come. "Old habit," I told him. "Death in Oxford seldom keeps to its department." In the sunlight, the carvings on the stone walls appeared almost animate, as though centuries of saints and sinners had learned to eavesdrop. We paused by a notice board outside the chapel. A small sheet of paper fluttered there, announcing the date of the next fellowship election. Someone had scrawled across it in pencil. No vacancy without consequence. I traced the words lightly. The handwriting slanted, careful, feminine, would stay in my mind long after the rain had washed it away. Inside the chapel, the organist was practicing. The sound filled the air with something both mournful and defiant, as though Bach himself were reminding us that symmetry was the only order left in chaos. I sat for a while, not praying, but listening. From where I sat, I could see the plaque commemorating past fellows. The archivist's name, of course, was not yet among them. Death takes time to become official in Oxford. When I rose to leave, I noticed a small detail. The hymn numbers from the previous Sunday had not been changed. They formed an odd sequence, 1/9, 3T2, 54. Later that evening, while idly glancing through the archivist's notebook, I saw the same numbers scribbled in the margin beside a poem by Keats. "Fellowship of Shadows," he'd written beneath it. The phrase seemed to belong to neither the hymn nor the poem. I underlined it, unsure why. Lewis, practical as ever, thought I was chasing coincidence. I envied his certainty. But I could not escape the feeling that the archivist had been writing to someone or about someone. That phrase, "Fellowship of Shadows," felt less poetic than coded. Perhaps a meeting, a society, a warning. Oxford, after all, breeds its secrets in Latin, then buries them beneath the timetables of evensong. As we left the college, the afternoon light fractured through the mullioned windows, scattering gold across the flagstones. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the stairwell shape, withdrawing just beyond recognition. Lewis said it was nothing. He was probably right, yet something about the stillness that followed felt staged, as though the entire building were holding its breath. That night, back in my flat, I poured a drink I didn't need and sat by the window, staring at the faint outline of St. Mary's spire against the bruised sky. I thought of the woman with the disciplined voice and the tremor in her throat. of the penciled threat of a dead man who wrote poetry in code. Oxford, I told myself, had always been a fellowship of shadows, some chosen, others condemned. And I, for reasons I scarcely understood, had once again found my place among them. She was standing there when I arrived, poised, unspeaking, her silhouette framed by the iron curve of the college gate. The light had begun to sink, that treacherous Oxford twilight when everything appears more beautiful than it truly is. I remember thinking she looked like someone rehearsing the art of waiting. The porter had told me there was a visitor. He'd said it with the small suspicion that often accompanies women who come asking for dead men. I walked down the gravel path toward her, my footsteps muffled by the hush that descends on the city just before evensong. She turned at the sound, but not in surprise. There was a calm precision to her movements, as though she had anticipated me entirely. She said she had known the archivist. I believed her not because of what she said, but because of the way she said it. She spoke with the cautious reverence of someone describing a lost country, one she had left voluntarily but could never stop mapping. I asked how well she'd known him. Her eyes moved past me to the chapel spire, as if the question were impertinent to both of us. Well enough, she said finally, to know he wasn't careless. I offered to walk her to the porter's lodge, though she declined. Some silences, she added, are safer at the gate. I found myself agreeing without knowing why. When she left, I lingered, watching her cross the square. There was something about the angle of her stride, measured, almost ceremonial, that made me think she had not come merely to mourn. There are many ways to say goodbye in Oxford. Few are honest. Inside, Lewis was waiting by the notice board, his expression the same mixture of patience and disapproval I'd come to rely on. He said she hadn't given her name. Of course she hadn't. Names in this city are a form of currency spent only when necessary. We stood for a while, neither of us speaking. The evening air had the faint sweetness of lilacs from the college garden, mingled with the sour note of rain on stone. Somewhere a bicycle bell rang, brief, indifferent, and then was gone. I told Lewis about the phrase I'd found in the archivist's notes, Fellowship of Shadows. He looked unimpressed. Could be a literary society, he said. Or a bad poem. He was right in part. But there was a tremor beneath those words that refused to settle. Later, as we crossed the bridge toward Holywell, I mentioned the woman. He shrugged. She could be anyone, a student, a lover, a ghost of the college. His tone was meant to be dismissive, yet he looked back, just once, at the gate behind us. Back home, I poured a whiskey I didn't intend to drink. I found myself returning to her words. He wasn't careless. The archivist, by all accounts, had been meticulous, almost obsessively so. His catalogues were admired for their precision, his handwriting enviable in its restraint. Careless men do not leave behind words that sound like codes. I took out the small notebook I had borrowed from his desk. Between the pages, a faint trace of perfume lingered, not the cloying kind, but something faintly metallic, like rain soaked into paper. There, pressed flat against an index card, was a tram ticket from Vienna. I turned it over. On the back, in delicate script, was a line from Rilke. Perhaps everything terrible is something helpless that wants help from us. It wasn't the handwriting of the archivist. It was hers. I didn't know how, but I was certain. The same discipline, the same precision, the kind that resists sentiment even while drowning in it. I thought again of the gate, of the way she'd stood neither entering nor leaving, suspended between grief and guilt. There's a kind of devotion in hesitation, a love that refuses to choose its direction. Oxford, with its gates and boundaries, thrives on such indecision. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's began their slow tolling. I closed the notebook, knowing I'd return to it again before morning. The phrase echoed faintly in my mind. He wasn't careless. No, he wasn't. But someone else had been, or perhaps wanted to seem so. A misplaced manuscript, a scrawled message, a ticket from a foreign city. It was beginning to sound less like a coincidence and more like choreography. As I drew the curtains against the night, I caught sight of my own reflection in the glass-blurred, uncertain, half-ghost. The rain had begun again, striking the window in slow, deliberate intervals. Somewhere, perhaps at that very moment, the woman was walking beneath it, coat collar raised, her footsteps dissolving into the sound of water. And though I did not yet know her name, I had the uneasy conviction that she knew mine. It began, as these things so often do, with an envelope that should not have existed. No return address, only my name written in a hand I recognized without recognition, elegant, deliberate, the kind of script that reveals a mind unwilling to surrender control, even in panic. The porter at my building had left it beneath my door. I found it that morning, face down, half soaked by the damp that creeps in from the stairwell. Inside was a single sheet of thin ivory paper, the watermark faint as breath. A few lines, nothing more. He didn't misplace it. He hid it. And beneath that, a name. Or rather, the ghost of one. The ink had bled slightly, as though someone had tried to erase it with water and failed. The first letter, an E, the last, a smudge. Between them, nothing but suggestions. I placed the note beside my breakfast tray, untouched since dawn. The crossword in the Times lay open to the half-completed grid from the day before. I've often found the small disciplines of the morning paper more honest than people. Clues, after all, never lie. They merely wait to be understood. One clue stood unfinished deceiver, hiding truth within silence. 7. I remember staring at it for some time, the answer lurking just beyond articulation. Mutedly? Secrecy? Neither fit. It was Lewis who interrupted the moment, knocking with the faint impatience of a man unused to visiting before noon. He said there'd been a development. The woman or woman at the gate had left Oxford. A taxi from St. Aldate's to the I station, an early train to London, no forwarding address. He'd spoken to the driver. Middle-aged, talkative, fond of irrelevant details. The kind of man who remembered weather more vividly than faces. He said she carried no luggage, only a book. I asked what kind. He shrugged. Some poetry thing, he said. The driver couldn't recall the title, but he remembered she'd opened it halfway through the journey, reading aloud under her breath. Something about forgetting. After Lewis left, I turned again to the note. The handwriting, I was certain, was the same as that on the tram ticket from Vienna. The slant identical, the pressure light almost reluctant. It spoke of a person accustomed to concealment. He didn't misplace it. He hid it. I thought of the archivist's notebook's margins filled with half-translations, cryptic allusions to lost letters, unfinished sentences that trailed into ellipses. He had hidden something, yes, but not out of fear. Concealment in his world was a form of preservation. Knowledge too easily found is too easily destroyed. It was then that my eyes drifted back to the crossword. Deceiver, hiding truth within silence, 7. And quite suddenly, I saw it. Mute, liar, mutilar. No, but close mutilate. To damage in hiding. To preserve by ruin. I circled the clue. The thought was irrational, but it led me somewhere. That afternoon I returned to St. Friderswyde's library. The rain had turned the air heavy, the smell of wet coats and paper mingling like the aftermath of an old confession. The librarian, a man of fastidious habits, watched me from behind his desk, suspicious of anyone who handled books with intent. I asked to see the romantic manuscripts again, the ones the archivist had catalogued. He obliged reluctantly, producing a stack of folders too neatly arranged to be untouched. I opened the first file. Nothing unusual. The second, the same. But in the third, between two unrelated poems, a folded slip of paper rested, flattened by years of quiet wait. A single word written on it in that same pale ink, Eleanor. The name felt inevitable. A name one doesn't so much discover as remember. I placed it gently on the desk, unwilling to disturb its long repose. When I left, the evening had grown darker than it should have. The gates of the college stood ajar, the porter absent. Somewhere, unseen, the organ began its practice again, a slow, minor progression that felt like thought turning into memory. Back in my flat, I unfolded the note once more. He didn't misplace it. He hid it. The name Eleanor fit into its sentence like a final chord resolving into silence. And yet, as I read it again, I realized it was not a message meant for me at all. It was an apology. There are rooms in Oxford that remember more than the people who built them. The library at St. Friedeswide's was one of those places, its shelves older than its catalogues, its air so thick with dust and silence that one almost felt trespassing upon a consciousness not entirely human. I arrived just after dusk. The porter, reluctant to admit me, had muttered about regulations and closures, but a small gesture mentioning the dean's approval, entirely fabricated, secured my entry. I found myself alone among the books, or nearly alone. The light from the high windows fell in tired bands across the long reading tables, where old wood gleamed like the surface of stagnant water. It was not my first time in that library, though it felt like it. Every visit rearranges the place, I think. Shadows trade corners. The smell of paper shifts its allegiance from decay to memory. I remember pausing beside a shelf labeled Letters and Miscellanea, where the archivist had done most of his work. His absence had not yet settled properly. Some chairs refused to forget their occupants. Lewis had warned me against chasing ghosts. He meant it kindly, as he always did. He thought I was too fond of symmetry, too quick to find meaning in coincidence. Perhaps he was right. But it is difficult to stand in a room like that and not feel that the past is waiting, just beyond the reach of reason, for someone foolish enough to listen. I began with the notebooks he'd left behind. 3 of them, bound in brittle calfskin, marked only with Roman numerals. The handwriting was immaculate, upright, restrained, almost monastic. The entries were what one might expect. References to catalogues, lists of donors, fragments of poetry noted without commentary. Yet between them, a pattern began to whisper. Each entry contained an annotation date, a shelf code, and a single letter in the margin. At first glance, nothing unusual. Archivists are creatures of habit. But there was repetition. The letters formed a sequence that cycled irregularly through E-L-O-R-A-N. I did not need to write it down to know what it spelled when rearranged. The first flicker of realization, like most truths, arrived quietly. Not revelation, merely recognition. The library had not merely stored his secrets, it had catalogued them. He had hidden something here under the guise of scholarship, using his profession as camouflage. I moved through the aisles, tracing the codes he'd written. The air was cold enough to bite. At the far end, beneath a flickering lamp, I found the section marked Correspondence, 1801-84, shelf B17. The corresponding letter in his notes had been O. I pulled down the volume and laid it open. Between 2 yellowing letters, a folded sheet rested, newer than its surroundings. I unfolded it slowly. A library slip. Borrowed Keats' early fragments, issued to Eleanor Webb. The date had been smudged, but not erased. It was from 6 months before the archivist's death. Eleanor, the woman at the gate. The name that had circled me like a refrain I could not stop humming. She had borrowed the manuscript he'd spent his life cataloguing. Or perhaps he had lent it to her. There is a difference, though not one library cares to acknowledge. As I stood there, the clock above the entrance struck 7. The sound was slow, deliberate, each chime unraveling into the quiet like the residue of thought. I replaced the slip carefully and closed the book. Something, a whisper, a shift in air, made me glance back toward the reading tables. For an instant, I thought I saw a figure seated there, half concealed in shadow. A trick of the light, perhaps, or memory rehearsing itself again. I left the library with the slip still faintly visible in my mind, its ink, its careful script. Outside, the rain had returned, falling with the quiet persistence of something that expected to be forgiven. Lewis met me at the gate, holding a newspaper under his arm. He asked whether I'd found what I was looking for. I told him I hadn't. It was true, in the way truth sometimes is when it hides the more delicate fact beneath. He mentioned the inquest, scheduled for the following week. Routine, he said. No surprises expected. As we parted, he added almost casually that the library catalogue showed a single overdue item, Keats' early fragments, due back 6 months ago. I did not ask whose name was beside it. I already knew. That night I dreamt of the reading room again, rows of books turning their faces toward the door as I entered, each whispering in its own brittle voice. It seemed to me that Oxford had no use for ghosts. It had the perfect substitute archives that forgot nothing. It was a small gathering, the sort Oxford hosts 100 times a tremolite, dull and faintly theatrical. The kind where the wine is too warm, the conversation too careful, and the laughter just a shade too loud to be genuine. I had been invited, though I can no longer recall by whom. The senior common room of St. Fridswide's was awash in candlelight and low chatter, and someone had thought sherry an appropriate offering to the gods of academia. I remember the smell before the taste, syrupy, with a sweetness that clung to the air like deceit. The dean was there, and the librarian, and 2 or 3 fellows whose names I'd already forgotten but whose self-satisfaction needed no introduction. They spoke of grants, lectureships, and minor scandals that would never see daylight. Oxford gossip is like old parchment. It crumbles if handled too directly. It was the librarian who poured my glass, his hands too steady for a man who had lost a colleague. He asked, with a kind of polite vagueness, whether I was still concerned about the archivist's death. I said I wasn't sure what concern had to do with it. He smiled, a slow tightening of the mouth, as though pleased by my choice of words. Concern, after all, is safer than belief. The sherry was too sweet, cloying even. I sipped it once, then left it untouched beside a stack of journals. Across the room, I noticed her, Eleanor. She stood by the window, speaking to no one, her glass empty. Her presence was like a misplaced note in a well-rehearsed sonata, barely discordant, but unmistakable. She caught my gaze briefly and looked away, though not before something passed between us. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. Lewis arrived late, uncomfortable in his suit and determined to appear invisible. He muttered that such occasions were for people with too much to hide. I told him that it was precisely the sort of room we ought to observe. He frowned, though not disagreeably, and drifted toward the buffet in search of safer conversation. It was an hour later when the librarian collapsed, a quiet fall, almost graceful. The sound of his glass breaking was the only indecorous thing about it. By the time I reached him, the dean was already kneeling beside the body, calling his name in the wrong tone, the one reserved for formal condolences, not for rescue. Someone opened a window. The night air swept in, carrying with it the faint toll of distant bells. The doctor who arrived pronounced it heart failure, convenient as truths in Oxford often are. Yet as the others clustered around, I noticed a detail. None of them did the librarian's lips. A faint sheen of residue, not crimson, but amber, and smelling faintly of almonds. My mind supplied the answer even as I wished it hadn't. Lewis whispered later, outside in the quad, that I was imagining things. He was right to say so. I needed him to. But when I asked who had poured the sherry, he hesitated. The dean, perhaps, or one of the fellows, or Eleanor. He wasn't sure. No one ever is after the glass has been drained. I walked her home that night. Not far, only to the edge of the square, where the lamps dimmed and the college walls began to dissolve into shadow. She spoke very little. When I mentioned the librarian, she said quietly that he'd once loved the archivist's work more than the man himself. I asked what that meant. She said it was a dangerous thing, to fall in love with what someone remembers rather than what they are. At her gate, she paused. The wind lifted a strand of hair across her face, and she didn't move to brush it away. She said I shouldn't look for what was hidden, that sometimes hiding is all the honesty one can manage. Then she was gone, the gate closing with the kind of finality that feels rehearsed. I went home and poured myself a whiskey that had not been offered to me. The bitterness was almost a comfort. On the table, the sherry glass I had abandoned still waited, the liquid inside untouched, viscous under the lamplight. I lifted it once more, brought it to my lips, and stopped. The faint scent of almonds lingered there too. In the morning, the newspapers would call it a tragedy, unexpected but natural. They would print no mention of Eleanor, or of the archivist, or of a sweetness too deliberate to be innocent, but I would remember that evening as one remembers a note played for too long, a harmony spoiled by an excess of sugar. Oxford, after all, has never been fond of bitterness. It prefers its poisons sweet. There are moments, even now, when I hear the faint scratch of pen on paper and imagine it's his steady, deliberate, utterly certain of itself. The archivist wrote as though his thoughts required architecture. Each line had balance, symmetry, and some private mathematics of grief that only he understood. In death, as in life, he left behind an order so precise it could only have been meant to conceal disorder. The morning after the librarian's death, I returned to the college. The rain had given way to a thin mist that blurred the outlines of the Radcliffe dome, turning Oxford into a city half-remembered. Lewis had gone ahead, though I found him outside the chapel, smoking with the self-conscious guilt of a man who knows he shouldn't. He asked whether I believed in coincidence. I told him that Oxford was built on every meeting, every death, every discovery, all disguised as happenstance. Inside the librarian's office, the scent of polish and sherry still lingered. His desk, as expected, was immaculate. But beneath the surface neatness, there was something studied, too much symmetry, too deliberate an order. Lewis, in his well-meaning way, called it tidiness. I called it choreography. He asked what I meant. I told him that the dead often tidy up for the living. Among the papers, I found a folded envelope addressed not to a person, but to a place, the reading room, St. Fridwhide's library. Inside, a single sheet of graph paper covered in numbers, columns and rows in groups of 6. Beneath them, a faintly penciled note for him, as promised. Lewis leaned over my shoulder. "Some sort of code," he said. I told him that much was obvious, but I had seen something like it before years ago, in a case involving an old college bursar who had hidden wartime letters in a cipher. The archivist had been fascinated by ciphers, particularly those that relied on literature, words as keys, books as vaults. I turned the paper toward the light. The handwriting was not the librarian's, it was Eleanor's. Her angular precision, her reluctance to press too hard, a woman's restraint masquerading as calm. The numbers, I realized, were not random. Each sequence corresponded to a line and word position, possibly from a specific text. But which? We searched the drawers, the shelves, and the small cabinet by the window. Then, in the bottom drawer of the desk, beneath a ledger, I found Keats' early fragments, the same title on the overdue library slip. I opened the book, and there, tucked between the final pages, was a second note here again. He said the truth would be safer in beauty. It was then I understood. The numbers were coordinates for lines of poetry Keats' own words arranged to form a message. I began decoding the first few 14, 3, 5, 12, 7, 9, and slowly, with the aid of a pencil and too much patience, a phrase began to appear. The fellowship met in silence. Lewis said it meant nothing. I disagreed. It meant everything. The archivist, the librarian, Eleanor, they had been part of something not quite official, not quite innocent. A fellowship that had chosen silence as its creed. Scholars, perhaps, or lovers of the forbidden kind. Those who seek truth where the university forbids it. He asked how I could be certain. I told him I wasn't. Certainty is the dull cousin of intuition. That evening, I walked alone through the cloisters. The lamps had not yet been lit, and the air carried the faint perfume of lilies from the chapel. I thought of Eleanor's handwriting, of the sweetness of poisoned sherry, of ciphers disguised as literature. Oxford, I decided, was a city addicted to concealment of its crimes, no different from its studies, both carried out under the pretense of light. At the gate, I saw her again, or thought I did. A figure in a dark coat, motionless beneath the archway, watching the square as though waiting for someone who would never arrive. When I approached, she was gone. Only the echo of her footsteps remained, fading into the night's damp hush. Back in my room, I unfolded the cipher once more. The decoded words, "The fellowship met in silence," rested on the table beside my glass. Beneath them, the numbers continued, waiting. I traced the next set idly, translating as I went, but silence was not enough. I stopped there. The clock on the mantel chimed once, a hollow sound in an empty room. I poured another whiskey and watched the ink blur under the lamplight, thinking of the archivist, Eleanor, of a library that remembered more than it should. Perhaps the cipher wasn't meant to be solved. Perhaps it was meant to endure an unfinished conversation between the living and the dead. In Oxford, after all, some secrets are less dangerous when left untranslated. The case, as it then stood, seemed closed, or so everyone preferred to believe. Oxford has a genius for premature conclusions. It wraps ambiguity in Latin and files it under solved. The inquest was brief, decorous, and utterly predictable. The archivist's death, accidental. The librarian's unfortunate but unrelated. The rest, administrative coincidence. The university, after all, dislikes the scent of scandal more than the fact of it. Lewis, with a sense of duty I both admired and pitied, accepted the verdict. He said it was time to let the matter rest. I told him I was trying. I wasn't. Something in the symmetry of those deaths refused to sit quietly within me. The archivist, the librarian, Eleanor, all circled a secret that would not quite name itself. It was raining again that night, the soft, constant kind that turns Oxford into a cathedral of reflections. I sat by the window of my flat, the cipher spread before me, the decoded phrases incomplete but insistent. The fellowship met in silence, but silence was not enough. I read it again and again, the way one rereads a line of poetry one suspects is lying. At midnight, I walked to St. Fritzwide's. The gates were locked, but the smaller door beside the porter's lodge yielded to the kind of key one carries out of habit, not authority. Inside, the air was thick with damp stone and candle soot. The corridors echoed faintly, as if rehearsing footsteps that no longer existed. I made my way to the library, lit only by the dim security lamp above the entrance. The rows of shelves stood like sentinels. I went to the table where I had found the cipher. The Keats volume was gone. In its place, a single envelope. No address this time, no handwriting I recognized. I opened it. Inside, a single sheet. "You were right, but for the wrong reason." I read it twice before realizing what chilled me was not the message, but the timing. Only 3 people could have known where to leave it. One was dead, one buried by bureaucracy, and one I had watched her walk away into the mist 2 nights ago. Unless she hadn't. When I turned, the motion wasn't sound, but awareness. The faint sense of being observed, as if the air itself had developed an intelligence. Then a voice, quiet and close, saying I shouldn't have come back. Eleanor stepped into the circle of light, her face half in shadow. She looked thinner, her eyes brittle with sleeplessness. I told her the cipher wasn't complete, that there were words missing. She said it was meant to be incomplete. That was the point. I asked her about the librarian. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed a small key on the table, the kind used for filing drawers. She said he had loved order more than truth. He'd thought tidiness could erase consequence. When I asked if she meant guilt, she smiled faintly. Something like that. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that weighs more than speech. The key glinted between us like punctuation in a sentence neither of us could finish. She said the archivist hadn't died by accident. He'd discovered what the fellowship had hidden. Not money, not fame, something smaller, more human. A mistake, a falsified document, a career preserved by omission. The kind of truth Oxford quietly forgives if buried deeply enough. I told her that didn't explain the librarian's death. She looked at the glass window above the door, where the rain was tracing its delicate arithmetic. He chose his own end, she said. He couldn't live inside his own correction. She rose then, gathering her coat around her. I asked what her part had been. She paused at the threshold. I wrote the cipher, she said. Not for him. For you. Then she left, and the echo of her steps faded into the corridor, swallowed by stone. I sat there until dawn, the note before me, the key untouched. I could have pursued it, the drawer it opened, the confession it contained. But something in her voice had stopped me. The truth, once unburied, rarely improves a life. When I finally left the library, the rain had ceased. The square outside glistened with the quiet aftermath of its own cleansing. Lewis would later ask if I'd found what I was looking for. I told him yes. It was a lie, but one with enough truth to sound believable. I returned home and opened the Times crossword. The first clue read, "False solution conceals a truer loss." 9. I smiled, faintly, and left it blank. There is a kind of silence peculiar to Oxford in late autumn, a silence not of absence, but of restraint. The city holds its breath as if guarding a confession too delicate to utter. I've come to think of that silence as hers. Eleanor's. It was a week after the inquest when she returned. Not to the college, not to her room, she knew better than that, but to the place that had started it all. The library. I found her there, seated at the far table beneath the great clock, a book open but unread. The air smelled faintly of damp wool and old varnish, and somewhere in the rafters a pigeon shifted, scattering dust onto the light below. She did not seem surprised to see me. Perhaps she had been waiting. Her eyes had the stillness of someone who has already rehearsed the conversation to its quiet end. She asked if I'd solved it. I told her I'd stopped trying. It wasn't true, of course. I will never stop trying. But there are moments when one must allow illusion to survive unchallenged. She smiled at that tiringly, without malice, and said that men like me needed their puzzles more than their answers. I asked her if that was why she wrote the cipher. She said it was why he read it. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The clock's ticking grew impossibly loud, like a metronome marking the pace of our restraint. Then, softly, I asked what she had hidden. She looked down at her hands. They were clasped tightly on the table, fingers interlaced as if trying to contain something fragile. "Not what you think," she said. "I didn't hide a crime. I hid my kindness." I thought then of the archivist's notebooks, of the erased lines, the careful omissions that had seemed at first so sinister. Perhaps they weren't concealments of guilt at all, but of pity. She said he had been trying to protect someone, the librarian, perhaps both. That he had found something that could have ruined reputations, ended careers, shattered the delicate architecture of their small academic world. A falsified signature, a forged reference, a lie of convenience that had become structural, and when he refused to destroy it, someone else had. I asked if that someone was her. She said nothing, but silence, in Oxford, is the most articulate of answers. Lewis would later ask me if I thought she was guilty. I told him guilt is a matter for priests, not detectives. What interested me was motive, the quiet, private kind that grows in the space between affection and fear. I had seen that look before in widows who lied to spare their dead, in scholars who falsified brilliance to preserve it. There is a purity, sometimes, in deceit. She rose to leave then, pulling her coat close. I noticed her gloves thin, frayed at the edges, too elegant for the weather. She reached into her pocket and drew out a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the table without looking at me. "For him," she said. "Not for you." When she was gone, I sat for a time before unfolding it. It was a poem. Keats again, naturally. The same hand as before, sharp, beautiful, refusing sentiment, a single stanza underlined in faint pencil. I'm certain of nothing but the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of imagination. Beneath it, she had written one line of her own. He believed the truth could be kind. I knew it could not. That was all. Outside, the fog had thickened, wrapping the Radcliffe dome in gauze. The lamps glowed dimly through it, halos of amber dissolving in the wet air. I walked through the square, the cobblestones slick and uneven beneath my shoes. Somewhere, a choir rehearsed unseen, the voices rising and falling like waves against the stone. When I reached the gate, I turned back once more toward the library. Its windows were dark now, the building itself receding into shadow. I thought of her words, the truth of imagination, and realized that what she had hidden was not evidence, but mercy. She had rewritten the ending of someone else's story, the way one might erase a final line to spare a reader pain. Perhaps that is what truth really is, not the sum of what happened, but what one allows to remain. Later, alone in my flat, I placed the poem beside the cipher, the note, and the tram ticket from Vienna. They looked almost beautiful together, fragments of a confession neither complete nor false. I poured a whiskey, though it did little to steady me, and thought of her walking through the mist, unburdened but unredeemed. Oxford forgets nothing. It merely waits for the next man to remember. I remember the first time I saw the quiet room at All Souls. A name too deliberate to be innocent. It wasn't truly a room, more an alcove hidden between two staircases, an architectural oversight that had been corrected by neglect. The college used it, occasionally, for visiting scholars who required isolation. Or so the porter said, with a kind of tone that suggests isolation was not always voluntary. I had gone there on a whim, though I've never really believed in whims. They are merely instincts one is too embarrassed to call reason. Something in the archivist's papers, an address half erased, a reference to silence and soul had led me to the place. I told myself it was curiosity. It wasn't. It was a kind of hunger, the sort that comes when the mind has almost solved something and the heart refuses to let it go. The porter handed me the key reluctantly, muttering that the room hadn't been used since spring. He was wrong, of course. The lock turned too easily. The key had been inside the door not long before. The air was colder there than elsewhere, the kind of cold that feels sentient. One lamp stood on a narrow desk, and beside it a chair angled toward the window. The glass was thick with condensation, muting the view of the quad below into a soft, grey abstraction. A faint smell of books, of damp, wool, of something extinguished too late. I don't know what I expected to find. Perhaps a letter. Perhaps nothing. What I found was both less and more a photograph, face down and a chessboard frozen mid-game. The photograph, when turned, revealed the three of them, the archivist, the librarian, and Eleanor seated at that same table, though years younger, the same pieces arranged in a nearly identical position. The archivist's hand hovered above a pawn, uncertain. The librarian's gaze fixed on him, patient, affectionate, or something dangerously near it. Eleanor, at the edge, was half smiling. It was a smile without joy, the kind that belongs to someone who has already seen how the game will end. Lewis would have called it circumstantial. He would have been right. But there are moments when intuition feels less like deduction and more like déjà vu. The kind of knowing that comes from recognizing a sorrow before it has introduced itself. The position on the chessboard intrigued me. White to move, though the next move was impossible, a bishop pinned, a knight sacrificed too early. It was a dead position, a game that could end only in resignation. Yet one piece stood out, the black queen, slightly misaligned from her square. I adjusted it, more out of instinct than logic. Beneath it, a folded scrap of paper. In the end, all we can defend is silence. The handwriting was his, the archivist. I had seen it enough times to know the rhythm of his despair. I turned it over, blank, and yet faintly pressed into the paper, as if written and then erased, another word lingered. Forgive. I sat there for a long while, listening to the rain deepen against the window, the slow, irregular patter like the sound of thought. Oxford outside had dissolved into mist. Only the lamplight of the quad remained, shivering through the fog like the pulse of something ancient and tired. When I finally rose, I saw a book lying beneath the desk. Keats again. Letters on the Nature of Truth. I opened it, half expecting her handwriting, but found instead a single bookmarker tram ticket from Vienna. The same one, perhaps, or another of its kind. Beneath the printed fare, someone had written in delicate pencil, "There is no quiet in forgiveness." It was then I realized what bound them. Not conspiracy, not murder, not even love. It was the inability to forgive what had been done in good faith. The archivist had hidden something to protect the librarian. The librarian had drunk his own poison to preserve her, and she, Eleanor, had erased their motives to spare the rest of us from understanding them too well. It was a kindness or cruelty, depending on the light. I placed the paper back beneath the queen. Some truths are best resealed. As I left, the porter was waiting at the foot of the stairs, his eyes unreadable. He asked if I'd found what I was looking for. I told him I hadn't been looking, not really. He nodded as though he understood, which of course he didn't. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving behind that peculiar Oxford stillness that feels both sacred and suspicious. The lamps reflected on the wet stones of the quad. Twin worlds, one above, one equally uncertain. Back in my room, I poured a whiskey and wrote the day's date in my notebook. Beneath it, only one line. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the refusal to speak the wrong truth. I slept poorly that night, and when I dreamed, it was of the quiet room empty now, yet filled with the faint hum of a move never made. It was a quiet evening, the sort that Oxford saves for those who've earned their solitude. The city was already sinking into darkness, the air sharp with the promise of frost. I had taken refuge in a small corner of Randolph, a place half forgotten even by its regulars. The barman, a man of delicate discretion, had poured me a glass of Amontillado without asking. I took it as a kindness or an omen. I had not touched sherry since that night in St. Friddiswide's, and even now its sweetness unsettled me. But memory, like wine, is rarely served in moderation. It insists on being tasted, whether one desires it or not. Lewis had sent word that the college was closing its file. The deaths, officially unconnected, were administratively explained. The archivist's accident, the librarian's heart, the woman who vanished like the aftertaste of her own name. Nothing to link them but conjecture and me. He said it was time to let it rest. I told him I would, and I almost believed it. Outside, the street lamps threw their fractured halos against the wet cobblestones. Somewhere beyond the fog, a church bell sounded distant, unhurried, and painfully precise. Oxford has a way of counting time, not by minutes, but by regrets. I unfolded the last of the papers she'd left me, the poem, the cipher, the tram ticket, and laid them on the table like cards in a losing hand. The words were familiar now, worn smooth by repetition. Yet something in them still resisted meaning. Beneath the fragments, a faint dusting of graphite caught the light. I brushed it aside and saw for the first time what I'd missed, the faint impression of a second hand. His, perhaps, guiding hers. He believed the truth could be kind. She had not written that alone. It struck me then, not as revelation, but as quiet confirmation that they had not opposed each other as I had once thought. The archivist, the librarian, Eleanor, they were complicit, yes, but not in deceit, in preservation. Their silence had been a shared act of mercy, not of guilt. A correction made not to history, but to humanity. I drained the glass and asked for another. The barman hesitated. He knew better than to encourage indulgence, but poured it nonetheless. The liquid caught the lamplight like liquid amber, fragile and defiant. I held it for a long while before drinking, tasting not sweetness but a faint echo of bitterness beneath. Even Amontillado carries its own regret. Lewis arrived then, unannounced, as he often did when he sensed I was lost in thought dangerous to my own peace. He said he'd been walking, that the air did him good. I doubted it. He asked if I'd finally solved it. I told him it wasn't that kind of case. He said it never was with me. We sat for a time in companionable silence. He fiddled with a newspaper crossword, muttering clues under his breath. I watched him fill in the word mercy where justice would have also fit. He didn't notice his own mistake, or perhaps it wasn't one. When he left, I remained. The bar had emptied, and the city beyond the window seemed to exhale. I thought of her then, not with longing nor anger, but with a kind of reluctant understanding. Eleanor, who had hidden truth not out of fear, but love, who had written her confession in the language of omission. I wondered, not for the first time, whether I would have done the same, whether I already had. The final sip of sherry clung to the glass, pale and incomplete. I placed it down carefully, the sound soft against the wood. The waiter came to clear the table, and for a moment he paused. He asked if I wanted another. I shook my head. Enough sweetness for one life, I told him. He smiled, uncertain, and left me to the company of my ghosts. Outside, the fog had thickened. The lamps along Beaumont Street flickered like thoughts refusing extinction. I turned up my collar and stepped into the cold, the air tasting faintly of rain and old secrets. Somewhere, a door closed with deliberate grace. Somewhere, perhaps, the truth waited still, unspoken, undesired, and mercifully incomplete. And as I walked toward the quiet hum of the city, I thought not for the first time that some endings are merely pauses, and that Oxford, for all its light, will always keep a little darkness in reserve.